As we continue on the journey into the 39 Melachot of prohibited activities on Shabbat that are having to do with making leather, we move into me'abed, which is tanning, and memachek, which is smoothing. In previous videos, we covered trapping the animal, slaughtering the animal, and skinning the animal. So the next step is working with the raw hides. Raw hides are perishable and will decay if they're not preserved. So this process of preservation is called tanning or me'abed. And this is the process that makes the skins into leather. This process typically requires 3 steps, any one of which would be considered me'abed and therefore prohibited on Shabbat. So curing, which involves soaking the animal skin in a concentrated salt solution to dehydrate the skin and prevent it from spoiling before it's actually tanned, would be prohibited. Tanning, which is completely cleaning the skin of hair and soaking it in increasingly stronger solutions for weeks in order to process it. And then there's the process of finishing the leather, and that can be adding oil to it to make it soft. It can be trampling on it and compressing it together to make it something that's thick and rigid, like what we have on the soles of our shoes. So how would this apply to a typical Shabbat that we have today? Well, it would be prohibited to mix up a large amount of salt or vinegar solution on Shabbat that could look as if you're going to pickle vegetables, since this is similar to what was done to the hides. It's also prohibited on Shabbat to salt a plate of vegetables or a bowl of vegetables and just leave them sit. It would be preferable to salt the pieces one at a time just before eating. Or if you're adding salt to a bowl full of vegetables that you're going to use for a salad, it would not be a problem to add the salt if immediately afterwards you're going to be diluting the salt by adding other ingredients to make a dressing. Now, if you do make homemade pickles, you decide you want to open the jar of pickles on Shabbat and you take one out and you realize that it's not pickled well enough, it would be prohibited to put it back in the jar for further pickling until after Shabbat. You'll also want to make sure that your leather shoes are polished or oiled prior to Shabbat. Also any leather belts or hats, check them before Shabbat so if they're needing of attention that you can care for them before Shabbat starts. Since any kind of shoe polish would be a violation of dyeing soveya, often that has preservatives in them, and that would be preserving the leather, which is part of the tanning process. Also, if you have shoes that have been wet and now they've dried and they're kind of crumpled and you want to straighten them out, it would be prohibited to put a shoe tree into the shoes in order to straighten them out on Shabbat. Now, if it's your custom just to maintain your shoes by inserting a shoe tree into them normally, and there's nothing wrong with the shoes, there's no prohibition on using a shoe tree under those circumstances on Shabbat. Now, with just a few minor changes in my habits in the kitchen and preparing what I'm going to wear on Shabbat ahead of time, I find this category of Shabbat prohibited activities very easy to follow through with, since I'm now aware of them. The next Melacha, memachek, or smoothing, presents a bit more of a challenge. So after the animal is trapped, slaughtered, skinned, and the skin is tanned into leather, the next step is to smooth the leather. Some portions of hair may still be present that need to be scraped off to make the surface completely smooth. So all of these, any actions regarding smoothing would be considered memachek and prohibited on Shabbat. So any scraping or sanding of any surface to make it smooth, since it's the action and not the item that's being smooth that's the problem for Shabbat. So this does not only apply to animal skins. So any hard surface, whether it's wood, metal, would be prohibited to scrape it or to sand it. Smoothing a hard surface to make it more useful. Removing or scraping bark from wood or wooden furniture. Sanding out a nick in the furniture that catches on your clothing would be prohibited on Shabbat. Scraping mud off of leather shoes with a knife would be prohibited, since invariably you're going to be scraping right along the surface of the leather shoe. What makes this one a bit more challenging and complicated is that it also applies to soft, pliable substances that are pliable enough to be molded or smeared. So smearing a pliant solid substance, including wax or tar or some kind of congealed fat, which we find in many cosmetic creams, or using putty would be problematic. Pressing a semi-soft substance like a piece of wax or chewing gum in to plug a hole in a container would be prohibited on Shabbat. Many have braces and they need to use the beeswax to prevent the sharp edges from cutting into their mouth, and it would be prohibited to smear those on Shabbat. Also using chapstick, since chapstick is a moldable substance, and every time you use it, you're actually smoothing it, so that would be prohibited on Shabbat. Now, we don't handle candles on Shabbat, but on a Yom Tov it would be possible to handle candles, but for you to melt the end of the candle with the fire in order to fit it into the candle holder, that would be prohibited because that would be molding. Since old-fashioned soaps were more pliant and moldable and had a rougher surface, it was forbidden to use bar soap, since it would become smoother and smoother with each use. So as far as bar soaps go, I think most people do avoid using them. You'll want to talk to your rabbi about the use of bar soaps on Shabbat if that's something that's important to you. Typically, the use of lotions and liquid soaps that are pourable are not such a problem on Shabbat, but using thicker creams would be problematic. Ointments and pastes may all be prohibited on Shabbat. So if you use a thick cleansing cream to wash your face, it may be better to move to a liquid skin cleanser, lotion, or soap. If you're used to using hand creams for dry skin, it may be better to use something that has a much looser consistency for Shabbat use. These are two good subjects to take up with your rabbi to see how best to adjust your own personal routine, because there are many details in these that can either make something permitted or not permitted on Shabbat, so the specifics are important. When using antibiotic ointment, it's permitted to dab it onto a cut on Shabbat and then place the Band-Aid over it, since you're not smearing the substance. Likewise, if applying ointment to a diaper rash, it's permitted to dab the ointment onto the diaper rash, and then when the diaper is put over the child, it's going to naturally just smear the ointment around, so it will cover all areas of the rash. There is a lot here, so take it slow as you add to your Shabbat experience. Don't try and take on too much too fast and get overwhelmed and frustrated. Everyone who keeps Shabbat did not jump into it all at once. Some may have had the advantage that they learned these things slowly as they were children and kept adding them as they grew. Others of us did not start until adulthood. That adds the complication of having to change habits rather than just learning them for the first time. So be patient with yourself and know that Hashem is smiling at every move that you take in connecting with Him through these laws of Shabbat. So continue on your journey, and with Torch.